smash subscribe, hit like, and drop a comment if you ready for a true story that will mess with your sense of identity. Because this one starts in a courtroom, not a cradle. The courtroom was silent when the judge's gavel struck. Not the respectful silence of procedure, but the kind that presses against your ears, the kind that makes every breath feel illegal. Outside, snow drifted across Oslo's streets, clean and white, hiding decades of mistakes beneath a fresh layer of calm. Inside, a woman in her late 50s stood alone at the plaintiff's table, hands clenched, eyes fixed forward, as if staring long enough might rewind her life. Her name was Ingrid, and she was about to tell the court that everything she knew about herself was wrong. The case file was thick, yellowed pages, hospital logs, typed memos stamped confidential. For nearly 60 years, those papers had slept in storage, buried under policy changes and renovations, and new administrators who never asked what had been left behind. Now they were awake, and they told a story that Norway hadn't wanted to hear. Ingrid had grown up believing she was ordinary. A childhood in a coastal town, a mother who hummed while cooking, a father who worked long hours and spoke little. Family photos showed a baby bundled in knit blankets, passed from arm to arm, a life beginning the way lives are supposed to begin. Except the baby in those photos wasn't Ingrid. Not biologically, not legally, not anymore. The truth had arrived quietly, as truths often do, through a letter from a government office requesting a routine update, a mismatch in records, a clerical curiosity. At first, it felt harmless. Ingrid laughed it off, made tea, told herself mistakes happened. But then the questions multiplied. Birth times that didn't align, blood types that didn't match, a nurse's signature that appeared twice on two different birth charts, same minute, same ward. When Ingrid asked the hospital for clarity, the replies came slow and careful, polite, vague, the kind of language institutions use when they're hoping confusion will fade into fatigue. It didn't. It sharpened. A retired midwife was tracked down. Her memory was brittle, but one detail remained intact. A chaotic night shift in the mid-1960s. 2 women in labor. Power flickers. Charts stacked at the foot of the beds. Babies crying. A moment. Just one. When the room filled with urgency and someone said, "Hand me the other one." That moment had lasted less than a heartbeat. It had lasted a lifetime. Investigators began pulling threads. Municipal archives. Storage rooms that smelled like dust and metal. Boxes sealed with tape that had turned brittle with age. A pattern emerged. No malice, just speed and certainty. The belief that systems don't fail because they shouldn't. Ingrid's life was proof that they do. The danger wasn't a man with a weapon or a chase through dark streets. It was quieter, more devastating. The danger was in what the truth would do to everyone it touched. Ingrid's parents were gone. The people who raised her would never answer the questions that now screamed inside her. Somewhere out there was another woman, her mirror, raised by a different family. As the investigation widened, the state grew nervous. Letters turned defensive. Access was delayed. Files were temporarily unavailable. A sense settled over the case, heavy and unmistakable. This one wasn't just about a swapped baby. It was about accountability, about whether a government could be forced to admit that an error had quietly rewritten 2 entire lives. Ingrid's lawyers framed it as a human rights violation. The right to identity, the right to family life, the right to know where you come from. The state argued the opposite. That time had healed all wounds, that reopening the past would cause more harm than good. They called it unfortunate. They called it resolved. Ingrid called it theft. On the final day of preliminary hearings, a clerk wheeled in a cart from the hospital's archive, one last box found behind a false wall during renovations. Inside were delivery room logs thought to be destroyed, names crossed out, numbers overwritten, and a handwritten note at the bottom of one page, cramped and hurried, as if written by someone who knew they wouldn't get a second chance. Corrected after transfer. Do not circulate. The courtroom leaned forward. Ingrid felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Because that note meant someone had known, and they had chosen silence. The revelation from the hidden archive box sent shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond it. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps in Oslo, their breath fogging in the winter air as they repeated the same phrase over and over, switched at birth. What had once been a private unraveling of one woman's identity was now a national reckoning. Behind closed doors, the government moved fast, but not in the way Ingrid had hoped. Within days, The Ministry of Health issued a statement expressing deep regret for historical record-keeping practices, carefully avoiding any admission of responsibility. Hospital administrators retired suddenly. Emails went unanswered. Requests for interviews were redirected into silence. It felt less like damage control and more like a slow retreat, as if the truth might lose momentum if everyone simply stopped talking. Ingrid did not stop. She sat across from investigators in a narrow conference room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, recounting a life that no longer felt like her own. Childhood illnesses that made no sense in retrospect. Medical histories that never aligned. The persistent feeling, impossible to explain, that she had grown up as a guest in her own skin. Then came the DNA test. The result arrived in a sealed envelope, thin and deceptively light. Ingrid stared at it for a long time before opening it, as though delaying the moment might preserve the last fragments of certainty she had left. When she finally read the report, her hands began to shake. No biological relation. Not to the parents who had raised her. Not to the extended family whose faces mirrored nothing in her own. The people she had buried, mourned, and loved were suddenly strangers by blood. The document did not soften the truth. It reduced nearly 60 years of belonging to a clinical conclusion. The investigators followed the data trail outward. Birth records from the same ward. Same night. Same hour. One other infant flagged as a possible match. A woman living quietly in another part of Norway, unaware that her life was about to fracture just as violently. Contacting her was risky, ethically complicated, potentially devastating. But the court ordered it. She was told there had been a discrepancy. Asked if she would consent to testing. She said yes, curious but calm, with no idea that the ground beneath her childhood was already cracking. When the results came back, there was no ambiguity left to hide behind. They were each other's biological families. 2 women, 2 lives, 1 mistake. As the evidence stacked up, something else surfaced, something darker. Internal memos revealed that hospital administrators had discovered the swap years earlier during a digitization project. The error had been flagged, reviewed, and then quietly marked as non-actionable. The reasoning was brutal in its simplicity. Too much time had passed. Too many lives would be disrupted. Better to let sleeping truths lie. Ingrid's lawyers seized on it immediately. This was no longer just negligence. It was concealment. The courtroom transformed from a place of facts into a battleground of morality. Government attorneys argued that revealing the truth earlier would have caused irreparable psychological harm. Ingrid's side countered that the harm had already been done, only now it had a name. Meanwhile, the pressure mounted outside the case. Ingrid began receiving messages from strangers. Some supportive, others cruel. People debated her life as if it were a thought experiment. Would you want to know? Would you sue? Would you give your parents back if you could? Every opinion felt like another hand pulling at the fragile seams of her identity. The other woman, the one who shared Ingrid's blood, asked for distance. She was not ready. She had children, a life built on certainty. The truth threatened to collapse it all, and she needed time to decide whether knowing Ingrid would be a bridge or a wreckage. That hesitation became ammunition for the state. They argued that Ingrid was forcing trauma onto others, that her pursuit of justice endangered innocent lives, that her lawsuit was selfish, vindictive, unnecessary. Ingrid listened as her life was dissected by people who had never lived it. Then, just as the case seemed to stall under legal maneuvering, a former hospital clerk stepped forward. Anonymous at first, nervous, but carrying something no one else had. A personal notebook. Inside were dates, initials, and observations scribbled in the margins during night shifts decades earlier. One entry was underlined twice. Babies moved. Told not to ask. The clerk was ready to testify. And with that, the case crossed an invisible line, from tragic mistake to deliberate silence. The final hearings began under a sky the color of steel. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavier than it had at any point during the trial. This was no longer about records or procedures. It was about judgment, moral and legal, and everyone in the room knew it. Ingrid sat straight-backed, her face composed in the way people learn to be when they've cried enough already. The former hospital clerk took the stand first. Their voice trembled at the beginning, but steadied as the notebook was introduced into evidence. Page by page, the court listened as a system revealed itself, not through policy, but through fear. Junior staff warned not to question supervisors. Errors quietly corrected on paper, but never spoken aloud. A culture where silence was framed as compassion and truth as a threat. The defense tried to dismantle the testimony. Memory fades, they argued. Notes can be misunderstood. Intent is impossible to prove after so many decades. But then the prosecutor asked the question that changed the room. If this was a harmless administrative correction, she said, why was it marked "Do not circulate"? There was no answer. Next came the experts. Psychologists described identity as a foundation, not a detail. You could build a life without wealth, without certainty, even without love, but without identity, everything else rested on borrowed ground. Human rights scholars spoke of precedent, of responsibility, of what it meant when a state decided that the cost of truth was too high to pay. Ingrid testified last. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She told the court about standing in front of a mirror and searching for resemblance that was never there. About family medical histories that felt like guessing games. About birthdays that now carried a second shadow. Another woman, somewhere else, blowing out candles meant for Ingrid's life. I am not asking for my past back, she said. I am asking for the truth to be acknowledged. The state's closing argument was careful, almost sorrowful. They spoke of stability, of unintended harm, of the danger of reopening old wounds. They insisted no one had acted with malice, that the past should be judged by the standards of its time. The judge listened without interruption. When the ruling came, it was not theatrical. There was no dramatic pause, just a measured voice delivering words that would ripple far beyond the courtroom walls. The court found that Ingrid's right to identity had been violated, that the state's failure to inform her, once the truth was known, constituted a breach of fundamental human rights. That silence, in this case, was not mercy. The damages awarded were significant, but the money barely registered. What mattered was the language of the judgment, the acknowledgement, the official record stating that what happened to Ingrid was wrong. Outside, cameras flashed. Headlines formed before Ingrid reached the courthouse steps. Switched at birth. 6 decades of silence. State liable. But the ending was not clean. The woman who shared Ingrid's blood never came to court. She sent a letter instead. Kind, cautious, distant. She wished Ingrid peace. She was not ready for more. Perhaps she never would be. The hospital issued a formal apology weeks later, buried beneath policy announcements and promises of reform. New safeguards, new procedures, new assurances that this would never happen again. Ingrid returned home alone. She placed the DNA report, the judgment, and the faded hospital records into a box she labeled simply truth. It did not give her answers to every question. It did not restore the years shaped by a mistake she never chose. But it gave her something she had lived without for nearly 60 years. Certainty. The certainty that she had not imagined the disconnect. The certainty that her life mattered enough to be corrected, even late. The certainty that silence is never harmless, only convenient. Sometimes justice arrives late. Sometimes it arrives quietly. And sometimes it arrives just loud enough to remind the world that identity is not paperwork and truth does not expire. If this story unsettled you, if it made you question how well any system truly protects us, then stay close. Subscribe, follow, and join us on the channel, because the next story waiting to be told may be even closer to home.